Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Amelia Layton. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Tacoma Art Museum in the Community and Public Engagement Department. I want to start by acknowledging that we learn, live, reflect, and teach on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. As our museum is specifically situated on the traditional homeland of the Puyallup Tribe of Indians, we make intentional efforts to create inclusive and respectful partnerships that honor Indigenous cultures, histories, identities, and socio-political realities. Throughout today's discussion, you're encouraged to ask questions in the Q&A and make use of the chat. The Q&A is down at the bottom of your screen, and that lets us know that you have a specific question. I'll be trying to monitor both. If you don't hear us answering your question right away, we will have time at the end to get to everyone's questions. We are here with the Race and Pedagogy Institute because of the Kinsey collection. Dr. Gordon, who's with us today, thank you, was an invaluable member of our community advisory panel for the exhibition and helped make this connection. The Kinsey African American Art and History Collection celebrates the achievements and contributions of Black Americans from 1595 to present times. Considered one of the most comprehensive surveys of African American history and culture outside of the Smithsonian Institution, the exhibition of the same name features the shared treasures amassed by Shirley and Bernard Kinsey during their 5 decades of marriage. Like I said, we hope you all have had a chance to see the exhibit or will soon. It's on view through November 28th. Now, Race and Pedagogy, in their 18 years, probably more like 19 now, of sustained, focused, and collaborative work, the Race and Pedagogy Institute has staged a range of more than 20 summits and conferences, spawned an assortment of collaborations across academia and communities, provided a variety of educational resources for transformative pedagogy on the Puget Sound campus and beyond, brought together disparate communities to generate vigorous thinking about race, equity, and inclusion, inspired a plethora of initiatives focused on the work of education and equality in both K-12 and higher education, and have been one of the voices of change seeking to transform the landscape of education on their campus and beyond. All of this has been undertaken as part of their mission of educating teachers and students at all levels to think critically about race and to act to eliminate racism. We're so happy to have partnered with them and hope to see this partnership flourish in the future. I want to turn it over to our moderators, Serena and Jalen, and I will let them do what they do best. So thanks for being here, y'all.
Thank you, Amelia, and thank you for everyone who's here today over Zoom. It's nice to be back. I'm going to go ahead and start with a land acknowledgement on behalf of the Race and Pedagogy Institute that was written in September of 2018. We begin this session with a heartfelt acknowledgement of the Puyallup Nation on whose land we stand. Despite being the targets of invasion, occupation, and displacement leading to centuries of trauma, the Puyallup people have extended to us the courtesy of a welcome to their home. We are guests and beneficiaries of this welcome. Through this acknowledgement, we signal our participation in the necessary project of reimagining the social contracts between Native people and the rest of us who have shown up through different routes to these Native nations. Our solidarity is with Native people in their efforts to end generations of historical trauma. Breathe in the beauty of these settings besides the Salish Sea. As guests, do take full advantage of every opportunity for learning and growth, but please do so with an awareness of the living heritage of the land on which we stand.
This statement was developed as part of the preparations for the 2018 Race and Pedagogy National Conference at the University of Puget Sound. Professor and Director of the Race and Pedagogy Institute, Dexter Gordon, developed the statement with the help of Professor Grace Livingston, with input from Puyallup Tribe of Indians Chief Leschi School's Director of Parent and Community Relations, Bina McLeod, and Professor Doug Sackman. We are joined by professors from the African American Studies Department and the Race and Pedagogy Institute. We are joined by Dr. Dexter Gordon, who is the Executive Vice President at Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. Dr. Grace Livingston, who is the Director of African American Studies at the University of Puget Sound. Dr. LaToya Brackett, Assistant Professor in African American Studies at the University of Puget Sound. Dr. Renee Sims, an associate professor in African American Studies here at the University of Puget Sound. Dr. Nancy Bristow, who is the chair of the history department here at the university, and Dr. Jonathan Stockdale, who is the director of Asian Studies here at the University of Puget Sound as well.
I'm really glad to be back on the panel today and to properly introduce myself. I'm Serena Sevison. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior student here at the University of Puget Sound. I'm majoring in African American Studies with a minor in education. And I'm here today to really talk with educators about the painting Slim. I sort of picked this piece while I was working with race and pedagogy over this past summer. I had come across Slim and thought about these sort of visual depictions of Blackness I had seen in modern media and was trying to think more historically backwards. And so in this initial brainstorming, I wanted to sort of discuss this power of imagery and how at the time of the Harlem Renaissance, there was a particular sort of resistance in Black art that was emerging. So this was creating a sort of avenue for new discussion surrounding influences of ideas of whiteness in art that were really emphasized up to this point. So I see this panel as a sort of expansion on ideas that I brought up in my initial research of the Kinsey collection, and something I'm really proud to hear and am excited about to see educators in sort of the intersections where they find themselves in the collection and artwork within their own disciplines.
To properly introduce myself, my name is Jalen Antoine. I use he, him pronouns. I am a senior student here at the University of Puget Sound, double majoring in African American Studies and economics. This past week, I was able to sit down with Serena and discuss what we thought about this artwork. As we were sitting and talking through, and I was able to view it a little bit more, I felt, discussing the significance, especially in the times that this painting was created, is that what I saw from the painting was, the significance of this piece is that we can clearly see a Black face painted. We can't see the details clearly, almost like he is being erased and forgotten. And I relate this to the work that the African American Studies Department, Race and Pedagogy Institute, other chairs and other faculty around campus who dive into these studies as well, and also the work that Serena and I do, because we are in FM studies, to make sure that history, especially Black history, isn't being glossed over, revisualized, or erased.
So before we get into sort of formal discussion, I actually wanted to bring in Dr. Gordon, who has some sort of insight that we wanted to look at together in terms of Slim. And for that, I'm going to just go ahead and give him the floor.
Thank you very much, Jalen. Thank you, Serena. It's a privilege to join my colleagues in the final of these three fora. I've been an observer of the other two and was really, really pleased with the insights and the observations of colleagues. Having been a part of the planning team, it's really a privilege to see the exhibit come to life. There was a lot of attention focusing on the significance of having this exhibit staged in Tacoma and making sure that there were local connections, and the local connections were really, have really been highlighted by the discussions thus far, and I'm pleased to see that. I want to thank Serena for, Serena, thank you for your insight in drawing our attention to Henry Bozeman Jones, and in particular to Slim, as part of our looking at this Kinsey exhibit. Exhibits, archives, museums are all spaces that are premised on important choices that emerge from the politics and the commitment of our own looking, our own gaze. And the gaze that all of us exhibit have to do with the sense of who we are. Our look and our gaze, our choice, our observations, recognition, selection. Where do we look? What do we look for? Whom do we look for? There's a real sense in which we all walk through the world looking for ourselves, sometimes to make sense of ourselves, sometimes to distinguish and differentiate ourselves from others. Sometimes we seek to identify ways in which we share commonalities with others. Finding our image is akin to hearing our name. It is the reason we turn our heads. It is the reason we respond. And it is for this reason that Lerone Bennett Jr.'s The Myth of Absence, highlighted by Bernard Kinsey, is so important to our consideration of museums, archives, Black lives, and education. How do we confront and counter the repeated telling and depiction of the story of Western civilization, the story of the Americas, the New World, the story of the United States, with Black people as invisible presences, as inaudible sounds, as incoherent stories? What does it feel like to be characterized as an invisible presence in a visual representation? What does it sound like to be an unspoken presence on the oral landscape of the American telling of history? I was drawn to Slim because instantly Slim reminded me of a photograph of myself at age 29. This painting of Bozeman could have been a painting of that photograph. And so as I gaze at this painting, I see myself, and I then grapple with the question of, why did it take so long for us to be represented? Why did it take so long for us to be acknowledged? What does it mean now that we're being acknowledged and some of the deeply offensive representations of history are being removed? The educational opportunity here is stark, and that's why I wanted to start here as a place where we can invoke the question of the myth of absence and acknowledge the emergence or the bringing into focus of a presence that was always there. We've been here, but unrepresented in museum and archival spaces. We've been here, but our sounds, our voices have been muted. We've been here. And so now we show up with a kind of boldness that makes us appreciate this Kinsey exhibit and use it actively in our classrooms.
Thanks, Serena.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. So moving forward with this discussion, we wanted to go ahead and immerse ourselves a little bit deeper into SLIM and sort of how this connects within disciplines, within different professors. And so I'm gonna go ahead and ask the first of our sets of questions. So this one has a couple in one, so feel free to, connect to whatever. So this collection is vast and expansive. What draws your attention within this collection? What does this connect in terms of your teaching or learning? And what about this art makes it legitimate? How does art become legitimized within your own disciplines?
Dr. Brackett, would you like to go first, or would you like me to go? Okay, I'm going. All right. First of all, let me just, like Dr. Gordon, say thank you and to acknowledge what an honor it is to be here with all of you. And especially thank you to Jalen and Serena for the hosting that you're doing and the leadership that you're showing today as you do every day on our campus. Well, to be honest, I mean, several pieces in the collection were for me breathtaking. And I use that word advisedly, meaning they took my breath away, that they made me gasp. None of them did so any more, I guess, than the shackles for a female enslaved person. And it wasn't just that this was an instrument of such evil, though certainly it is that. It wasn't only that the appearance could seem so innocent if you didn't know what you were looking at. And in fact, something that really worried me as I watched white museum goers walk right past. What was really, for me, made me gasp, I suppose, is that this material item from the enslavement period had bound a person, or maybe many people. And to be so close to it, for some reason, perhaps because I'm a historian and we experience this frequently, I think those of us who are really tied to learning and understanding the past, it just brought those people closer to me. So that the catastrophe that the enslaved endured was something that was standing alongside, declaring its presence, declaring those people's presence. As a teacher of African American history over at the university, one of the challenges of my work is to communicate to students the extent to which it is possible to communicate, that is, across what is a chasm, of course, of centuries and experiences, to somehow communicate the realities of what enslavement meant to the people. And here I mean children and elders, lovers and spouses, friends and parents, what it meant to those people who were enslaved. How can we imagine the pain and indignity, the cruelty, the trauma of this horrific institution that was built and enacted by human beings and wrought on human beings? As a teacher and as a white person, to be clear, I know that this ability to empathize, to make some connection to those experiences is a very heavy burden, and one that is far more likely to be born and in fact to traumatize my Black students. As a white person, I think it's a lot easier for us to turn away from the knowledge, the response that those shackles demand. And so I thank the Kinsey collection for the hard gift that they have given museum goers of seeing those shackles because of what seeing them demands of my humanity, of my capacity to reach across and try to imagine the woman or women who felt those shackles grate on their skin, to weigh on their muscles, to tear at their heart. To try as impossible as it may be to imagine her, to wonder about her, to mourn for what those shackles must have cost her. That is what their presence in the collection does, and is very much at the heart of what I need to do and try to do in my teaching. Well, another challenge that sits right alongside, I want to talk just for a moment about one other piece, because alongside that need to convey the inhumanity of this institution and practice and those who wielded power within that institution, you have to do that while also foregrounding the humanity, the personhood in all of its complexity of those who were enslaved, the enslaved people. How do you convey not just the trauma, but also the joy, not just the loss, but the building of families and communities, not just the repression, but the centuries-long strength and struggle, and perhaps most of all, the love that made survival possible, and not only for the enslaved people, but for the freed and then the free people that they gave birth to somehow convey to my students that amidst it all, there was the beauty of humanity. As James Baldwin expressed this in 1963, and yes, he is my go-to frequently when I need a good thought. As he said in 1963, Black people, though I'm aware that some of us Black and white do not know it yet, are very beautiful. And he wasn't lifting his community out of its history. He wasn't making it simple. He was instead seeing his teenage friends in what he called wine and urine-stained hallways, and he was recognizing how threatened their beauty was by the circumstances of this country. That threat alongside beauty is captured for me in the piece Field Hands, the 1988 painting from Jonathan Green. From a distance, the painting is bright. You're captured by the colors. You might think that this is a group of young people waiting to get on a school bus, and your heart is perhaps full. And then you look at the title and you realize that this is in fact a group of workers heading out for backbreaking work in fields likely belonging to someone else, that these are people subject to discriminatory laws and a justice system that's anything but. But the painting's vibrant colors, which are attached especially to these people, for me, call out the beauty and declare it amidst the draining everydayness of labor and repression. because that beauty was also part of the everydayness. And so I loved this piece because of the ways in which it put together those two pieces of my teaching, that tension between the inhumanity of repression and injustice and the beauty and humanity of those who have faced it. Dr. Brackett, I turn it to you, I think.
Okay, thank you, Nancy, Dr. Bristow. I actually think that the first piece that you were discussing, the shackles, kind of gets me into how I'm going to go about talking about the March on Washington program. I know Amelia probably can get that up there for everybody, but I think I need to share some positionality, because what I'm about to share as a Black woman who has 2 degrees in Black studies is we're often shackled not to share, and that is to speak about our own difficulties within our own race as Black folks with our Black brothers, right? So I'm going to start with that, because give a preface and ask those who, if you listen to me and you're like, oh, I don't know about that, I want you to ask yourself why you don't know about that, and why you don't feel comfortable with it, why you might not like how I might share, because that's the point, right? And that's what the archives allows us to do as we go back. So I think about being shackled as a Black female scholar, specifically in Black studies as well. And that kind of goes into the March on Washington program. So we all know, we think of the March on Washington and we don't finish the title, which is also part of what the archives allows us to do. It's for jobs and freedoms, right? And this is August 28, 1963, but we only seem to recall that Martin Luther King Jr. spoke. And there was a lot of people. That's kind of what we remember. And it's not the whole narrative. It's not even a quarter of it. So when I saw this piece in the museum, I was actually with my students. So this speaks to my teaching, but also it's going to speak to my learning as well. And so when I don't know why, something drew me to it. And then I just started to read down the program because I didn't ever have access to something like this. So I can actually probably share it, Amelia. I have it, or I can give you the link, and if you could share it, that'd be great. It's too many words for folks not to actually see it. I think I have it, or maybe I closed it, but it's on your Google Drive. I'll put it that way under documents, I believe. So it should be relatively easy to find. I don't want to take up my time trying to find it. So the program really made me click back to the fact that I do have 2 degrees in Black studies, and one of them is a prominent university, Cornell. And it wasn't until I started to teach that I realized that all I was learning was about Black men. That was a problem. And it's only when I have to start to teach and engage and realize, where am I? Where do I fit in this? And so when I was thinking about this program that seems to only have reference to women in it, right, as if they are entertainers. So they're either singing the national anthem or another piece or another song of some sort, or they are referencing a group of Black women that were important, but weren't all allowed to speak. So that gives you another example of what was disappointing to me, but it proved a reality that I was dealing with. And one of those realities pops up in an article written by Barbara Christian in 1988. And she was a prominent Black feminist scholar. And her title of her piece is called, "But Who Do You Really Belong To? Black Studies or Women's Studies?" And this is in 1988. And there's a paragraph here that I want to read to you about, to give you an idea of how it feels to be a Black woman scholar, right? That focuses on Black women. And she said, in regards to why she named it this, she says, "There is another reason for my title. Not so long ago, one of the graduate women of color on my campus came to me in tears because she'd been directly asked the question of the title. Her rage, her frustration at her integrity being questioned, her awareness that she was being characterized as marginal to these already marginalized university programs, caused her to doubt whether she could endure being a feminist scholar of color. Fragmentation, dilution, the need continually to defend one's existence, she thought, would be her fate." And so to see this document here and to see all the women that are missing is such a disappointment. And you think about, was that our fate? And so for me, looking at this, it was really deafening. And I asked my students to come. So this is that teaching component. I said, what's missing? And that's something that I use in a lot of the ways in which I engage. I ask students, well, what's missing? What aren't we seeing? And they have to be able to think critically to be able to look at that, right? And so there's a couple of other components here, and this goes to this idea of cracks. And this goes to Barbara Christian again, where she says, the one that we are usually, okay, so she's talking about Black women, you're either in women's studies, right? And you're the only one, you're in Black studies, you're the only female, right? Or you're in a traditional field and you're the token. And she says, the one that we are usually, the only woman in Black studies, the only person of color in women's studies, or in one traditional department. It is not that we fall between the cracks, but that we are the filler for too many cracks. What that kind of fragmentation can do to one's time is obvious. Let me read that one again. What that kind of fragmentation can do to one's time is obvious. Not always so obvious is the possible effects such fragmentation or bridging, depending on your point of view, might have on one's scholarly foci and intentions. How can we focus on the work that we need to create in Black studies, under the guise of Black studies, meaning an activist narrative doing things, if we don't have the time, if we're the filler for all the cracks? And so what I ended up doing with this is I actually went down the list, and then one of my students, that's in here that was with me, Jalen, actually said, well, there's, he says, I see some rabbis here, but I don't see any representation of Black Muslims. And so I started to look at it and I realized that there's more white men represented on this than there are Black women. And of course, none of the Black women really had words to share, except for, as they referenced her in under number 5, if you look at the list there, as Mrs. Medgar Evers, and that is not her real name, right? That's not all of her name. But Medgar Evers had passed recently, I think in the June of '63, not passed, he was assassinated. And so they put her on the stage to recognize this list of Black women freedom fighters, right? And Diane Nash is on there. So I was looking up Diane Nash briefly. I was like, let me just look up and see what's going on. And she wasn't there. And I don't know if people knew that. She wasn't there because she took a break. She and her husband, Bevel, he said, you know what, hun, everybody's going up to Washington. Why don't we stay behind since we just did all this work to put everybody on buses, to get everybody on buses, to do all this stuff. Let's just rest. And she said, yes. And so there's an article recent, I don't know how long ago, that talks to her, obviously years and years later, asking about that. And she said they just decided to rest. And when she was watching the march, she didn't know she was supposed to be on the stage. She didn't know she was going to be recognized. And then this quick note states that how close could she have really been if she didn't know she was going to be recognized? And then it made me think, to what extent did they even think of this idea in enough time for these women to be present? So there's so many layers to that. And so she missed it because she was tired, because she had been filling all the cracks. She was exhausted. And even though she is a big name for the civil rights movement, I think she's one of the few Black women that we do know named, yet she missed this. And I don't understand why. And I wonder if she really did. So the other component that I wanted to share is, like, it says Mrs. Her name is Merle Evers. She's the reason that, her husband's case was brought back to trial. Just like Martin Luther King's wife, Coretta Scott King, is the reason we have MLK Day. And so it speaks to the work that Black women even continue to do after the fact, that people are not always privy to or recognize as such. And so when I look, the Black women that are represented on here are artists, really important artists. Marian Anderson was an opera singer, internationally known. And then the choir director, Eva Jesse's, her choir, like, she was the most well-known, like one of the first internationally known choir directors or conductors. And then you get to King at the bottom at 16, but all those people before, but this is the only part that we remember. That's the one part that we remember. And then there's another caveat, and that's Mahalia Jackson. And this is where Dr. Gordon helped remind me when we were all talking about this, the fact that she's the one that behind King, when he was giving his speech, she said, tell him about the dream, King. Tell him about the dream. And we've gotten to know that this part of Martin Luther King's speech was not something he had written. It wasn't rehearsed. And it is a Black woman who told him to speak it, that encouraged him to go off script. And that's where we get this historical moment that people remember, but we don't remember the Black women that created it, right? Got the bodies there, did all that work. And so I wanted to share that because I really feel strongly about being able to look at documents now and ask, where were we? Because even to this day, I still have an issue with where are we and where do people see us? So Maura Barbara Christensen says that, okay, here we go. So she says, it can be devastating for the Black feminist scholar and can result in paralysis and a sense of alienation and the feeling that one is in a position of always validating oneself, that one must subscribe to reigning concerns of others. One must subscribe to reigning concerns of others. And that is what I see of our Black women and throughout history and even currently. So I wanted to share that briefly. And of course, I'll be sharing again soon about more about Black women and where we show up. But yeah, I just wanted to share that because I don't know if people really thought about what does the program say and what's missing, who's missing, and where do they fit them in. This is a really big divot. I wouldn't call it a crack number 5. They just kind of threw all of us up there and recognized us, but we weren't even really allowed to speak. So that says something else as well. So I'll leave it at that.
I'll jump in quickly. Serena, your question about how does the collection connect to our teaching and learning, it allows me as a teacher to add an experiential component to what the students are learning. So for example, in survey of African-American literature, we're looking at slave narratives right now. And we looked at Harriet Jacobs last week. And we had a discussion in class about how they learned about the period of enslavement for people of African descent when they were in, say, high school in K through 12, and how often we use abstract terms that don't really bring home the terror or what the lived experiences were like for the people who were enslaved. We talked about the difference between the textbooks maybe they read in K through 12 to the slave narratives that they were reading today, and what it means to hear in someone's own words what they lived through, the torture, the rape, etc. And I think about the shackles that Professor Bristow mentioned, and how this is another part of that story, right? So being able to go into the museum and actually see shackles that were used on a person, as Professor Bristow said, allows them to hear the story again in a new way, because they're looking at an object that was used to keep someone in bondage. And I think about the way it's behind glass on the wall, or plastic maybe, but it's in, it's contained, it's up kind of high so that you can look at it and you can kind of see how the metal has turned through the years. It just makes it more real. So they're getting not only the narratives of the enslaved people, but they're actually looking at the instruments that were used to keep them in bondage. And then I also think about the fact that this is a collection. And one of the things that I do in class is to always question how knowledge is constructed, especially when you have an anthology of literature, for example, or a collection of art, who put it together, who's included in the collection, who's left out, as Professor Brackett was saying. So it allows us to have that discussion too. Who are the Kinseys thinking about in the objects that they've decided to put into this collection? And then the fact that it's in a museum is then another layer to it. And I was looking the other day at an interview that the filmmaker Haile Gerima gave. He's the filmmaker who made Sankofa, and he's getting ready to be awarded by the Academy of Motion Pictures for that film and for his body of work. And they've got this new museum that they're opening on September 30th. And he was asked in a Vanity Fair interview how he feels about being feted now, so many decades later after the film has come out, when his work has he's not a filmmaker who's, well known in Hollywood. And the question posed to him was, you are not someone who is terribly interested in or preoccupied with the machinations of the academy, the politics of it, the makeup of it. Does it feel complicated to now be feted by them? And Garima's answer was about, not being feted by Hollywood so many years later, but he chose to focus on the museum. And he says, quote, I think the museum is one thing. The new approach the museum is taking is a very important factor for why I agreed to be part of it. There is a major proposition to be inclusive of non-white excluded filmmakers in the preservation and amplification of their works. And then the interviewer is like, well, thank you for focusing on the museum. I hadn't thought about the institution, part of it. And I think that's important because in teaching, about African-American history, literature, et cetera, it's one thing for us to do it in the classroom. It's something else than to go and see a Black Families collection. And then it's something else to consider that it's at the Tacoma Art Museum and that these are institutions that historically have not included our stories and artifacts and the objects. And so it gives it, this situation, this circumstance provides us an opportunity to have many discussions about both content and curation.
Thank you again, Serena and Jalen, and so much appreciation to my colleagues, continued appreciation. I want to start with the connection question you raised, Serena, and there were several moments of connection for me, but one of them came really early when I went to see the exhibition at the Tacoma Art Museum, and because I think there is a difference between collecting and exhibiting. Those are two different practices, and they are rife with possibilities for teaching and learning, and at the same time they're also full of questions of power, questions of dominant power and counter narration. It matters how you see something, how you experience it. So I had come in and I saw the portrait of the Kinsey family, and I turned right, continued, and I had gone and stayed with the documents of the enslavement ship. I had stayed there and moved along that wall, and I had just moved away from after seeing the accounts presented to the House of Commons regarding the African slave trade accounts, right? Money that was made on enslaved people as property. So I had just stayed with that. Then I moved into Phyllis Weekly and stayed there. And then I moved, and the next thing on the wall that hit me was a document called The Schedule Continued. And it was the schedule, and in smaller words, smaller writing was the word continued. And it was a schedule of over 500 enslaved people. The document says slaves for an owner, a plantation owner, an enslaver, William Law. And I stopped dead. And the other moment that felt that had a resonance to this was the moment when I looked at a slave carrying her fate in her hands, 1854. And I found myself then taking a seat and looking at that document and looking at the schedule. And why the schedule hits me that way and makes me think a lot about what it means to learn and to teach, among other things, is that it demonstrated so clearly to me how power and domination gets produced in the dailiness. One of my colleagues have talked about the everyday and the dailiness. And it allows us to see what power looks like, what supremacy looks like underneath, how it is made. And one of the challenges of teaching about African-American history is looking at those questions of power. And I just want to read a little bit from some notes I took about William Law. So we only see this document. So this is how this document comes to us. The document is revealed, but only so much. William Law was forced to sell his estate. Those people's names there, enslaved Black people on the island of Grenada to settle his debts. So not unlike the document of Frances carrying her fate in her hand, the explanation given by Crawford, the enslaver, is please, I had to do what I had to do because I had to sell you in order to build my stable of horses. I needed to develop that. So that connection for me was there. So this is an inventory document, and the language says of assets. And this only became public in some sort of way, in some limited way, when William Law was forced to sell because of his debts. So I think about how many forms of evidence are there, living evidence, everyday documents that show us how it is that enslavement was continued. How did it live from day to day? And it's important to me that this happened when the enslavement trade, the slave trade, was illegal, because it was abolished 15 years before 1820, legally abolished almost 15 years before. And this was an illegal action for which there was no accountability. And when you look at the document, what gets to me, there is a first name. So right there, the last name is assumed. It's the name of your owner. So we don't need to know the other name. Country. Africa is represented as a country as against a continental space. And the distinctions are made between African and Creole. Did I just buy you from the end, from ships coming into port, or were you reproduced in the space that we are in? And reproduced there needs to be seen. It grabbed me just looking at the document, the economic dimension of that, and the inhumane and the non-human making nature of the very document itself. Not only the practice, but the document kept track of how is it you make a human being into a non-human being. And it says supposed age and defining marks. Defining marks. Right arm amputated, once a toe, scars on both cheeks, left arm crooked, right arm amputated. So the purpose of the documentation is for the purpose of the uses of Black life for labor. That document, and it's called the schedule continued. So it's the repeated routinization. It's that continued nature that gets away from us. The ages go from 5 months to 59. And most of the names we were meant to read as gendered female names. It's hard to teach, but it's important for us that we teach about the silences that lie underneath the making of power. It's everydayness, it's wantonness, and that exclusions are seared into, it's literally seared into the very ways we live our lives, the very institutions of which we're part. And that's why I wanted to connect to the discussion about the museum. And that's why that this is at the museum is important, as my colleagues have said, and is significant. what it doesn't take care of is that the museum still signals whiteness. It still signals disparity and distance. The museum was still the place that Sarah J. Bartman, parts of her body remained in the Museum of France from 1915 until the turn of the 21st century, before through activism and scholarship, especially coming from Black women scholars, that her, and I say this advisedly, her body parts were repatriated. It took that kind of reckoning. It took that kind of force of thought and action to make that hiddenness of power, the hiding that also happens in museums. I'm not conflating that to the plantation, but the everydayness of that power. Why would it take 1815 to almost a century later for the activism to happen, for her sense of the body corpus to be returned? And so I think when it comes to questions of creating space was another part of what I thought about. When you're creating space, and especially space in a museum, I think of space in Black studies, and creating space, especially in terms of Black women scholars and Black thought that comes from Black women. I think about it has to be a very deliberate act of breaking through. It has to be a move to mark the power of exclusion, the repeated power of domination that also operates in patriarchy, that also repeats itself. We have to learn to not only speak truth to power, but speak truth to ourselves. It's an important thing, but it's also a heartbreaking thing that we still need the words of Barbara Christian Smith Scott, who gave us all the women are white, all the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. We still need the still brave text that came later. We still have these texts presumed incompetent that are still being reproduced. I'm thinking about the challenge of making space, and I will close here, or making space both in curricularly and in a space like the museum that still is overshadowed by these forms of power that live inside. And I probably can get to this later on, Amelia. There were three images: the portrait of a girl, African women that came out of done in the Harlem Renaissance period, and African women that give us ways to break through. When I was in the museum, I asked myself when I was looking, what did it take to even be able to imagine that, those images that capture the ordinariness, especially with Portrait of a Girl, but it captures the thinking, the fierceness, the being one's self in one's body. And the African women, the first one by Charles Alston, the second by Elsa Corta, you look there, and it was called a surrealist painting, but I think about the people like Octavia Butler, who broke through surrealism and took us into magical realism, what's called science fiction, sometimes now called Afrofuturism. What does it take for us to do the breakthrough work, to change the meaning of the space of the museum, to do the work we have to do in Black studies, and to dig up the power relations that just keep repeating themselves and hiding themselves? Thanks again to my colleagues.
say thank you to all the professors that weighed in. We'll move on to the next question. So earlier in the conversation, we talked about sort of the removal of Black women from a lot of these historical and significant images, especially their narratives, their storytelling. And throughout the Kinsey collection, we can see a lot of images of Black women. And I sort of want to ask a question to the professors. What is the distinction of Black women and their significance in these archives?
Thank you, Jalen. I know that I was gonna continue my my conversation a little bit here, and I know that you and Serena actually came up with some really great questions about, having Black women in the archives, and there was a part where you asked what images of Blackness are present when you introduce the work of Black women at the center. And so I kind of spoke to the fact that the work was missing in regards to the March on Washington. And then I'm going to share in the chat with you. Well, if I share it now, a lot of people in the audience will probably go to the link, but I'll try to hold on to it until the end because I don't want y'all to be distracted. But it is I'm going to send it to the hosts at least so we can remember, somebody can remember to share it with everybody in the future. But it's a Time magazine article in 2019 about Diane Nash, and it does reflect on the fact that A. Philip Randolph even forgot to say some of the names, and he looked at the women on the stage like, who was it? And they were like, Rosa Parks. So even the fact that a week before the march, they hadn't really ironed out what they were going to do about recognizing Black women. And then they the Black men said something along the lines of, we don't want to play favorites. And people think that, then infighting among the women. And I just thought, wow, infighting. So there's actually more discussion about that at that location. So I now will talk about what does get seen when you see us in the archives. And that was specifically something else that stood out to me was a letter by Zora Neale Hurston to to a man that would be her ex-husband. I think it was Albert Pierce III. And this is in 1942, which is going to be before the March on Washington, obviously. So it's actually the middle one there, the darkest coloring of one. And I was reading this and I was like, ooh, she's angry. And it was just such a nice thing to see of a Black woman back then, before now, showcasing that anger, showcasing that frustration with a Black man in regards to a romantic relationship, a partnership in what we're not really allowed to discuss. And so in a way, what I see happens what kind of images of Blackness are present once you actually bring Black women into it is the image of struggle. It's an image of being unsilenced. It's one to validate Black women as we engage in the archives, as I felt validated. And additionally, it's to frustrate us because it's one of those things where you're like, wow, even in 1942, right? And then thinking about 1963 with the March on Washington, still those frustrations. And so one of the things about her writing, so there's a part in here where Zora Neale Hurston, she basically, when she writes to him, she says something along the lines of, she didn't know him. She says, when you told me that I didn't know you, she says, I was laughing at you recently when you stood there telling me that I did not know you. That was true in 1940, but since then I have spent money to get the feats of your life from high school on, and none of it fits in with anybody I want to know. I know now that you can get a person out of the slums, but you can never get the slums out of the person. This is a harsh indictment, but you have earned it. Furthermore, by personal observation, I know you to be insane. And the first trouble I have with you, I shall ask the police to subject you to the sanity hearing. So the fact that she even writes about the presence of police to a Black man is just something we can't do as Black women. We cannot we can't give more clout to a fight against Black people, which first starts with Black men. But she didn't hold back what had been hurting her. What was her reality? And so she recognizes that this is saying that she would call the police is a harsh reality, but she had to state it. And at the end, she talks about, this part gets cut off a little bit. She says, all I ask is that you get out of my life and stay out. I know you're conceited, then I can't find that word. She says, the habit is going to make believe to others that this is a letter I wrote out of love. So I'm assuming what she's saying is that he's going to tell folks, oh, the letter she sent me was all love, we're all good. And then she says, but brother, comma, I am making several carbon copies. And I think she says, if I hear that you have even, she underlines, called my name to anybody, I shall share supplies across the campus. And that just instantly came to, kind of keep my name out of your mouth connotations within the African-American vernacular, like English, right? And the fact that she underlines it, it's typewritten, is really poignant. And she's saying, I'm done with this. I don't want to do this anymore. But I didn't learn much about Zora Neale Hurston until a colleague of mine who really appreciates Zora Neale Hurston told me more about how she was even ostracized back then. And now I can kind of see why. And it brings me today of like a Bell Hooks, who talks very candidly, directly about the relationship between Black men and Black women. And then it goes back to Barbara Christensen, who also appreciated Zora Neale Hurston, as I looked it up. And so back into her article about where we belong, she does say that there are scholars, I hear, who produce feminist theory, and there are those of us, I guess, who practice feminist theory. Among the latter are usually listed women of color. And that to me is Zora Neale Hurston. She's not theorizing what feminist theory is. She's actually acting upon it. She's not, dilute. She's not holding back who she is. And neither does Bell Hooks when I read her pieces. And usually when I mention Bell Hooks to some Black men scholars, they're like, oh, here we go. And I'm like, well, let's talk about it. Let's actually have that conversation so that we don't have to dismiss before we actually have, converse about what is creating these tensions in the first place. And so there's a part also in Barbara Christian's article where she says, we must, for example, so I'm going to bring it back. We must, for example, be concerned about the men of our cultural groups, and that concerns affects our understanding and articulation of feminist issues. For example, it is important to me that Black men in America have been just as fetishized as sex objects as women have been. And that realization affects my critique of gender issues. Yet, I and most of my sisters who are concerned about the relationship between men and women in our group would not replace the word feminist with gender, as so many women's studies institutions are doing today, so that men will feel more comfortable about the research of women. We all know the jump back from the word feminist, right? And so I really appreciate how she articulates what's happening there and how it also deletes some of our voices from being able to practice the feminist notions that we don't just theorize about, but actually do. And so then it gets back to kind of what some of the pieces I read of Bell Hooks, and specifically Killing Rage from 1993, I believe, where she reminds us that Black men are striving for a white patriarchy. And so that is a concern. And so as these white women, as she's saying specifically, are moving from feminist studies to gender studies to appease white men, so too, it must be seen that we should be doing the same. And she's saying, no, we shouldn't, and we won't. And so I really appreciated having all these kind of side by side. And the one thing that I would also say that goes back to the cracks that she's talking about in this article, Barbara Christian, is when we, as in Black women, are in the archives, we reveal all the cracks that we were, but we filled in the fight and experience of Black America. So if we are in the archives, you cannot, you won't miss the cracks that are covered up, right? We fill the cracks, and then on top of that, usually is maybe perhaps a Black man that gets the accolades of that, right? Because we filled it, and then there it is. But no one's ever sanded back a little bit and saw what was inside. And so in the archives, we can find what was hidden in the inside that was us, and be able to bring it to the forefront when people are now more ready to hear it. Who being more ready to hear it, I'm not always certain that discussion is figured out yet, but this was a really powerful letter for me, the Zora Neale Hurston one, just because it really did validate even what concerns today, and the anger that I saw her be able to have, because the one thing that I think that we would see in imagery, photos, even the ways in which Black women would speak about Black men back then, they're not going to speak ill. They're not going to do anything other than what is expected of them. And so even though those women were disrespected on the March on Washington, we never knew that. because they never said it. And so when do we really break that silence? Perhaps it's archives that allows us to use past engagement, like past realities, to speak currently about issues that are still permeating within our cultures. So I think I am finished, and I'll leave it with that. So thanks for those questions, Serena and Jalen.
I want to jump in and just talk about, build upon what's been said. And thank you for the questions also, Jalen and Serena. I think about the fact that when we exist in the archives, that there's extra work, like Professor Brackett was just saying, that we have to do to make that work known. So we have this letter of Zora from the 1940s. We know that she was publishing beginning in the early 20th century. We've got How It Feels to Be Colored Me in 1926. She was in anthologies, both during the Harlem Renaissance and slightly right before. So she, was publishing. She documented, we have documents of hers, letters, things like that. She publishes a book in 1937, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and then she disappears. So even when we have a record of the work that's been done in the brilliance and the genius, and this is something that Professor Livingston mentioned during our first conversation, it takes, Black women scholars to go back and dig that out and say, we're gonna put this work on our syllabus and add it to the curriculum. And that's why we have Their Eyes Were Watching God as this classic that everyone, reads sometimes in high school before they get to college. And so I'm thinking about the relationship between education and the archives, right? Black women scholars as digging through those archives and making us recognize and appreciate work that's there. I'm also thinking of Saidiya Hartman. That came to mind when Professor Brackett was talking, and thinking about how she has gone through archives to try to figure out how Black women were existing in urban spaces in the early 20th century in ways that resisted heteronormativity, domesticity, and trying to have their own lives and be free in a way that is the precursor to what we call like the flapper girl in history. And I'm thinking of the way that she takes, the archival material that she finds and then adds imagination to it, because there are these gaps, because there are parts that we don't know. So that she's using imagination to also fill out the lives of these women that are in the archives. So those are just a couple of things that I wanted to add to the conversation.
Thank you, Professor Brackett and Professor Sims. And to stay with the example of Zora Neale Hurston, and to probably add one more. So Zora Neale Hurston, and to connect it with what you have said, Professor Sims and Professor Brackett, and also to go to that period, Professor Brackett, that you spoke about in terms of the representation in those notable 1960s events like the March on Washington. I think about to start there, I think about Marion Wright Edelman in this moment, and she's known for the work, and she's marked for the work of the Children's Defense Fund. But it took the moment and the force of the Moral Mondays protests over the last, or movement and protests over the last 4 and 5 years, led by Reverend Dr. William Barber, and the pointing to the work of the Poor People's Campaign and organizing that in our present. For again, it took scholarship to bring, and it came out of Black feminist thought that was written in blogs that reminded us, but in some ways it's not a reminder. It almost had to go and get her out of the art. She wasn't even in an archive, that Marian Wright Edelman was the person who said to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., what about a poor people's campaign? Because of her emphasis on, her emphasis on families and children, she was paying attention to poor children. And it was she who whispered that, who said that, but when it became public, that's not the way that we come to know or frame the Poor People's Campaign, the Poor People's Campaign. So I think of Marian Wright Edelman in that way. And then I think about both of you and the way that you speak about Zora Neale Hurston, and that the text Their Eyes or Watching God and She Disappears From Us. One of the opportunities I had was to go to the Beinecke archives. Yale University owns that, and that's a different discussion about who owns a work, right? So that's there. And what I was able to see were the early versions in the archive. So it looked very much like the text that Dr. Brackett has showing us, that you saw the revision process, you saw the crossing out marks, you saw the handwriting. And I've often thought about what it would mean to use texts like those as ways to teach language and to teach writing, what it means to revise and what it means to have moments when the authority of Black women's thinking is challenged. So some of the times when I was reading that document, I thought about what was being revised here. Is how much of it was under the quotations of grammar and syntax, on quotation marks, and how much of it was in terms of her ideas. So I was looking at that text and saying to myself, what would it mean to teach that in mind? And I just think about what's being done in terms of reclamation work. And I'll stop here in 2019, especially because I have a relationship with the archives at the Highlander Center in Tennessee, Highlander Center for Education and Research, and also because of its historical importance for African American studies, because since 1932, it has been an activist training place that white supremacists burned down the library and the archives that were in the making in April of 2019. And since then, there's been leadership change at the Highlander, and Highlander now has as a co-director its first Black woman ever since 1932, and a Black queer woman as a co-director. And one of the pieces of restoration and reclamation and reckoning work they have done is to publicly to have public discussions about what caused that archive to be targeted, because it was doing Black history work, and especially work on Black women in the South who were marked out of the social movements work that was done there. And part of what they have done is to rename the center, the library, and the archives, the Septima Clark archives. And I think about what that means now to go back almost 80 years to get to retrieve Septima Clark, who was actually the teacher of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks in terms of teaching them organizing. But we don't remember that. And it took this kind of moment of arson on the archives to bring her back. Thanks very much for your thinking and work. Of Brackett and Robson.
I'd like to, if I may, just weigh in on that piece with one more figure, the notion of Black lives and Black women in particular being invisible and hidden in plain sight has come into focus over the last couple of years in a discussion that I am only recently tuning into, and that is the life of another Black woman. and that's Pauli Murray. I used Pauli Murray's work about 20 years ago. And I used that work because she studied the Caribbean diaspora in New York, but I knew nothing about her biography. And only recently, I'm finding out that Pauli Murray, born in Maryland, raised in the South, wanted to go to Barnard, but she was turned away because one, she couldn't afford it, and two, her education in the South was inadequate. And in 1926, both she and Zora Neale Hurston wanted to get into Barnard. Zora Neale Hurston was 34, an accomplished writer, and she got in only because somebody paid for her. And what I found out about Pauli Murray just shocked me, because as someone who tries to break down the absences and the false narratives about US history, especially around Brown v. Board of Education, I've always taught Brown with the notion that Charles Hamilton Houston is the unknown person who was the precursor of the Thurgood Marshall. And I've only recently found out that Pauli Murray was the one who guided Thurgood Marshall after Thurgood Marshall paid for her to go to Howard Law School as a law student and then as a law scholar. She was the one who guided Thurgood Marshall in the direction of using the 14th Amendment in what became Brown v. Board of Education. And then I found out that Pauli Murray was the one who said to Betty Friedan, let's start an NAACP for women. And that's what Betty Friedan named NOW. I also found out that Pauli Murray was the one who guided Ruth Bader Ginsburg in her arguments in favor of women's equality. And then I found out that Pauli Murray was a contemporary and wrote alongside James Baldwin. And then I found out that amidst all of that, Pauli Murray was an Episcopalian priest, and that the thing she was most exercised about, that she couldn't talk about, was the issue of her gender and sexuality. In today's language, Pauli Murray would identify as they, and her family struggled with how people wrote about her. Murray identified herself as a boy when she was growing up, as a girl sometimes, and as they. And so I thought, just listening to this discussion and thinking about the many invisibilities, this remarkable woman who was turned away from college and who became one of the leading lights in American life, is now being rediscovered, thankfully, hidden from us in plain sight.
I'm just gonna step in really fast. Amelia, are we doing okay on time? I just wanted to check it.
We have gone over, but I am happy to continue the conversation. I would say we probably have about 15 more minutes, and then we should head into any questions from the audience.
Okay, great. I'm gonna go ahead and pose one more question for everyone then. Especially in thinking about something Dr. Livingston was talking about earlier, and sort of this way that we legitimize sort of knowledge. And I think sort of what does the role of a collection do? How does the material, subjective material art, become valid in the eyes of different scholars or artists or students? And how do we connect this back to having a collection placed in the middle of our own community? What does this do? What is this role that it plays?
Dr. Gordon, I think you had something to say about this.
I was going to say no voices. I guess that's the role of the museum is really significant, and this question brings me to the Tacoma Art Museum and the question of African American museums. There's a Northwest African American Museum in Seattle, but I would suspect that only some, maybe only few of the people on this call know that there was an African American museum relatively recently in downtown Tacoma. And when I came to Tacoma in 2003, I heard about that museum. I was invited in 2004, in 2005 to join the board, and I was immediately advised not to join the board because of the fact that the museum was beleaguered. There was a major struggle underway to save the museum. I eventually joined the museum, and the museum still, we were unable to save the museum. But in the time of the museum, it was a most vibrant entity. We organized traveling exhibits, museum exhibits that we organized as small mobile travel exhibits that we sought to go to every high school in the region and several of the middle schools, because we recognized that the artifacts in the museum were focused on Black life, and that if we didn't take them to the schools, they would not be part of the education. And even when we took them to the schools, they were a separate entity, not integral to what the schools did. They were part of our special efforts. And so I want to just mark the need for museums to be integrated in our educational processes, because museums have been places that have been structured to be out of the reach of Black and Brown working and lower economic status families. There are many, many families that have never been to a museum. They've never felt invited. They've never felt that it was affordable. They've never been part of a narrative that structures museum as part of their lives. And so we had to take the museum's exhibits to these children. And so what can I say to the Tacoma Art Museum? One, thanks for hosting this exhibit. Two, there has to be a more significant footprint that gets to communities of color, to close that distance between museums as spaces for white wealth and white wealthy gaze, to museums as places where we curate and acknowledge the mundane everyday life of Slim. When I look at Slim, I see myself. When I think back about that photograph when I was 29, it's the photograph of a young Black man, any young Black man. And until we get to the place where in the Americas, any young Black person can see themselves as worthy of being represented, worthy of being remembered, being highlighted, being the focus. Until that time, we will still have a region of the world built by Black labor, built as anti-Black nations. Dr. Sims, I'm done.
Great answer.
Go, Dr. Grace. I see you.
Yes, I hear you. I hear Professor Sims too. I'm conscious of the just conscious of time and would love to hear people talk. But I do have continued thoughts about museums and that space. But I wonder if we could connect to any questions that are here, so we don't lose people after 2:30. And I also want to invite any of my colleagues who haven't, so I'm just looking, just in case Jonathan wants to, Dr. Stockdale would like to speak.
I think it's a good place to tell Amelia and TAM that we discussed, and Dr. Brackett focused on this, how much more time we would need if we would really talk about this. So message to TAM, there's much more to be said.
It's working in my brain. We're gonna return to this specific question if I have anything to say about it. And I would love to continue this conversation forward, regardless of whether the Kinsey collection is on the walls. This conversation is relevant and will continue to be relevant. And so, yes, we did have a question in the chat, and it's quite a lengthy question. So I'm going to read it. Bear with. Struck by the dehumanizing dynamics Dr. Livingston points out in Reckoning with the Schedule, looking at intricate and horrifying ways capitalism developed by being underwritten by the Black people whose bodies were commodified through such ledgers and the shackles that backed them up. Dr. Livingston also highlighted the role of art museums historically in participating in this dehumanizing trade, as with Sarah Bartman. For anyone, what do you see as the role and power of art and art museums in addressing or countering the power and legacies of racial capitalism versus being complicit in them? Great question.
I'm very interested in hearing Dr. Stockdale's voice, and I don't know if that question is directed at Dr. Livingston herself.
I will unmute to just say, I have a lot of thoughts, but I think some of them have maybe passed by the moment, and it really feels like the moment for audience participation.
I want to put in the space the fact that there's a lot of discussion about museums giving back looted, I'm going to use the word looted, artifacts. And some, I think I just had to search really quickly, but I know that like it says that the Netherlands, I think has a council to discuss those kind of things. So that would be something I just put in the space. I don't know much about it, but I know that it's something that's being discussed. A little late. Now, what does the reparations of that entail? Because you do make money, as Dr. Gordon was, talking about. Some people have never even stepped foot into a museum. It does cost money, right? So just thinking about, and even the fact of what is leisure for some folks is not going to be defined as going to a museum. So just thinking about what happens with the finances of those years, decades, maybe centuries of having that art, and what do you do with it? That would be something just to put into the spaces, what's happening.
I really like that. And I would add, so the question was about the role that artists have in kind of resisting racial capitalism. And, it just I don't have the answer, Professor Sackman, but in thinking about it, I think about the importance of curators and how important it is to have art, because to resist racial capitalism, you have to be able to imagine something different. And so having art that pushes the bounds. Octavia Butler was brought into the space. Those kinds of artists who can think beyond the present moment seems an important step in imagining what comes next, and having curators who can recognize art that maybe is not popular, maybe that's speaking to things that other people haven't yet articulated, seems important. So curation seems important. And I think museums can play a role in showcasing imagination that gives us a blueprint for what's next.
Thank you, colleagues. I think about an additional piece of the work in response to Professor Sackman's question is, I think about who we learn from, and I'm gonna go for a name that Professor Brackett brought into the space, Zora Hurston. It may feel, how capacious. We're just beginning to draw on her. We're looking at the way her research method for quote unquote, gathering the stories when she had to struggle to be called an anthropologist, as problematic as that was, she was called a folklorist. The methods that she used to collect, quote unquote, to listen to the voices of Black people as she went south, she went to the Carolinas, she went to Haiti, she went to Jamaica. The methods that she used are now being thought about as choreographical methods, right? As to choreograph dance and the stage. So what I'm getting at here is what would happen if we learned from her, because that work is now what we're realizing is that she can tell us something about how museums even put together what it thinks about before it does an exhibition, and then the work of after. So I think about break through that. It matters who you learn from, and where the positionality of those people in terms of gender and racialization and class and location. So I think that that matters, and I think you break through that by perhaps museums seeing themselves as part of the questioning of monuments. Now that's happening by this generation, not only this generation, but this generation of activists of color, of Black activists, of brown activists who are raising questions about monuments, asking them to repair, to do better, to take their stuff down and come again. So I think about that museums are part of the questions that are being asked about monuments, buildings, and spaces. And museums, in order to preserve the materials that are there, that's the difference now between collection, exhibition, and preservation. Museums eat up a lot of the capital of any place. Electricity, keeping stuff at temperature. I think about the amount of resources where people don't have electricity, don't have anywhere to cool their food, but museums have that. there's a whole restructuring that needs to be thought about, and that there's something museums owe in the present in relationship to the resources that you eat up every day. And is it in the name of exhibition? What kind of education? What kind of radical inclusion are museums doing?
The question makes me think about an item in the news recently. Hobby Lobby returning to Iraq the 3,600-year-old Gilgamesh tablets. And there is the intersection of capitalism and the presumption of the right to ownership, and whole civilizations, whole peoples who are brought under the heel of military power, capitalism's arm of domination. And so the question, I think, challenges us to rethink that which we take as normative. Living in the United States, it's very difficult to raise a question of, can we imagine living a different way? Well, how could Hobby Lobby come to own the tablets of Gilgamesh? What's identified as one of the original stories of a civilization from that existed across the world from the United States of America. It's because of the naturalization of the existing social order. And the naturalization says we can send our military, and then your money can buy anything our military can procure. And so I think we muse and grapple with that question as we grapple with our lives, because when those tablets of Gilgamesh were taken from Iraq, you can bet your bottom dollar they are put in a vault and or they're on display in museums that are exclusive to a small number of persons. So can museums be part of a democratic polity, be part of reinvigorating our society to engage the artifacts from the past? I think yes, but we have to reconsider the whole politics. Who makes the choices of what goes into those museums? Who make the choices of to whom museums are available? These exhibits, for example, I really like that in Tacoma, there's an effort to at least make one day, even if it's one day in the month, where the museums are available to the public. But when you hear, for example, the immoral amounts of money spent, trillions of dollars daily for 20 years to prosecute a war in Afghanistan. And I want you to hear me right. Trillions of dollars per day for 20 years to prosecute a war in Iraq. We can make museums free to Black and brown children.
If I may just quickly, I think it was the Race Matters series that we had, I guess that was last summer, where Dr. Amira Nimji and Dr. Wynn Woods talked about, I think it was about appropriation of Black culture, or at least we were talking about hip hop. And I remember I'm pretty sure it was a white male student who asked a question from the audience, and I was perplexed at how he was defining the purpose of, or how you categorize what is art and the purpose for whom the art is for. And so I feel like that clicked for me because he spoke of, because we talked about, you know, let's say hip hop music, you know, it's art. And then it's like, okay, who defines it? And he was kind of saying, well, if I can't listen to it, then it doesn't really exist as art, is kind of what he was alluding to in a way. He didn't say it that way, but that's how he came at it. And it perplexed me because I was saying, so you're saying the only way in which we can really, or the only way in which Black folks should be creating anything that would be artistic is if we know that white folks would listen to it or be or define it that way. So I start thinking about how do museums alter or redefine what art is and to whom, you know, as museums are probably at that locus of control at this point. They're the ones that can change that narrative in theory, because it was almost as if white folks don't want to see it, then it's not art, because they're the ones that create this idea of what is art. And then I just asked myself, what's up with the Mona Lisa? Why is that so exciting? You can go and you can see some histories about it, and really, people don't know. They really don't know. They have many theories. Some of it say it's the technique because it was a newer technique. Others say it's because it was in a royal, you know, exhibit. And so that royalty that's attached to it then gives it clout and then gives it, you know, capitalist, you know, gives it that financial backing of having to put it behind bulletproof glass. And so if you think about the artifacts been stolen from, you know, African nations and other nations of people of color, and then taken to white places, the only reason in which folks are going to see it is because of the exoticism of it, because it's different. And to learn about those people, right? And if something that we create is not something easily understood by the other, then therefore it's not art, or it doesn't teach them. So there's a lot going on here. So I think about graffiti. Oh, you're destroying a building. Well, give us canvas. Probably, you know, we would have, if that wouldn't have been what it is. It is art. So just thinking about that, and actually reminds, because that's literally what the title of my class next semester is, which is Black Culture is Art. So I think it's a really interesting conversation, because when that student was speaking, I was like, wow, is this how you perceive the work of those who are different from you as being made for you and only because of you? That's what I got from it. Now, if that's what he really intended, probably not, but that was the impact. And so I just wanted to bring that into the space of that conversation, because if some group gets to define what art is, and they also get to define how much it's worth. And I also draw to the Woman in Gold painting that was taken from a Jewish family, and then the fight, I guess, in the 1990s by one of the descendants of that family to get that painting back from Austria. And so thinking about how all that worked out, right? What that looks like, and the idea that, oh, it's too big of a piece to put in your, like, it's gonna just be in your house. You know, are they really talking about the details of the history behind it? Probably not. So just thinking in that regards of who gets to define art. And then as much as we want to bring Black and brown kids into a museum, how do they get told what a museum is? And that goes back to our education system. So it's just cycle. So I digress.
And we do need another session, because I said I was going to talk one time today. I had this, I swear this is the last thing. So it's not only what we procure and bring into the museum, or how it's displayed, how it's curated, but it's also just how museums look. And I'm not thinking of TAM in particular, I'm thinking about other museums in other cities, right? And all the steps that you have to go up, like it's a palace, right? It's the way, if we're going to talk about capitalism, we're talking about property, right? And the way that a lot of museums appear also plays into who it's appealing to, who the audience is, who's invited and who's not.
We have run over our time. This discussion has been incredible and so exciting for me. I have so many thoughts and feelings, and I want to talk about what a museum is and what it can be and how we can transform futures in this way. So I'll be in touch with all of our panelists and many of you in the audience too. This discussion is important. It's super relevant to where we are as a culture, as a city, as a museum. I think it's incredible to be having these conversations with you all. There is one person who has their hand up in the audience. And I'm going to allow them to talk in case they weren't allowed to type their question. So Mary, if your question still is relevant, please let us know. And you can be unmuted now. There you go.
I think I must have raised my hand by mistake.
Oh, well, there we go. No worries. I just wanted to make sure you were able to participate. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
So with that, I just want to thank you all. Does anyone have any, that was, for me, that was a great place to land. This power of art, power of museums, what collections can do. What is art? That blew my mind. I would love to have another 3 hours to talk about that with you. Next time we will do this again. But thank you all sincerely for coming. I'm going to put, Dr. Brackett had mentioned this article with Diane Nash earlier, but didn't paste it in case you were to leave us. That is now in the chat. Please go read it. Please reach out to me or any of our panelists if you have further thoughts on anything we discussed today. Go see the Kinsey exhibit. It's up until November 28th. We are free every Thursday from 5 to 8 p.m. and it is pay what you can on Sundays. So please come to the museum and see that multiple times. You'll want to spend some time there. Thanks for being with us and sticking with us as we did go over time, but I just appreciate you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia.
There's a question from Jasmine Brown
Oh, Jasmine,
in the chat.
did I miss it? Oh, where can we see the panelists' work? Most of their work is as professors. I'm not sure. Who's published? Where can we read you? Where can we see you?
Oh,
Most of us are at the University of Puget Sound, affiliated with Race and Pedagogy Institute. So if you look for Race and Pedagogy Institute, you will find us. And then Dr. Gordon, you could probably find him that way too. But he is now at the Evergreen. You can just put his name in Google.
Yeah.
Dexter Gordon, you'll find him. Probably right at the top. It'll be him. But yeah.
and there are books. Look up Renee Sims. Look up LaToya Brackett. There are books. Buy a couple books and make them rich.
Scholarly work. That's interesting. Most of our artists are probably educators, and then they don't get compensation for that the same way as some of the artists do. How about that?
Just another thing we can discuss at another one. Of these.
And the questioner can, look up Dr. Livingston's essays and talk about how can I buy those so that the producer gets benefit.
Absolutely.
Can I just add, Jasmine, it's a little bit challenging right now because of COVID in terms of inviting folks to campus, but we do try to make what we do public. And so usually there are all kinds of lecture series going on campus sponsored by African American Studies and Race and Pedagogy Institute that are really provocative and informative. And so if we could add you to the email list, then maybe that would be one way to be keeping informed. Although right now, a lot of those are kind of like on campus or Zoom.
I think University of Puget Sound has a Vimeo, not a YouTube, but a Vimeo page where you can probably, if you search for Race and Pedagogy or African American Studies, you should be able to find some videos of our past events as well.
And I think it's fair to just say this, that I will be presenting at Evergreen Tacoma in their Lyceum this coming Wednesday. I think it is September 29. So look up Lyceum, Evergreen State College, Tacoma campus.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Well, I'm going to end this for us here. Thanks for being with us. For those of you who stuck it out, thanks for being present with us and your great questions. This was great, y'all. Until next time.
Thank you, great.
Thanks, Serena. Jake,
Thank
thanks,
you,
Jalen.
Thank you, wonderful colleagues. This was fabulous.
Thank you so much.